The men who had enlisted in 1940 had long since shed their youthful idealism. They were drawn initially by the clean lines of the dress blues and the promise of belonging. Paris Island had stripped away that romantic veneer. It replaced it with the grim, practical reality of muddy green dungarees. They knew they were armed with the nation's cast-offs. As their civilian liner, the deceptive pleasure cruise gave way to the serious grey of the invasion fleet, the Marines of the 1st Division understood their place. In the global conflict, they were secondary. The Europe First policy meant the newest Garand M1 rifles went to others. Men like Jim McInerney wrestled instead with obsolete 40-year-old bolt-action Springfields. They wore World War I-style helmets. This gear felt less like protection and more like a cruel joke against the impending violence. The strategic imperative was clear: stop the Japanese expansion before Australia was isolated. But the execution was fraught with peril. As the massive invasion fleet approached the Solomons, the Japanese provided a terrifying preview of the air dominance they intended to maintain. High-flying enemy bombers attacked the transports. This turned the deployment into a jangling, nerve-wracking ordeal. The ships, packed with young men, dodged and twisted. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke and fear. Every explosion and every near miss reaffirmed the vulnerability of the fleet. This directly fueled the anxieties of the naval command. This intense exposure to enemy air power proved fatal to the entire logistical plan. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher cited the intolerable risk to his valuable carrier fleet. He also noted the lack of proper fighter cover. Fletcher made the agonizing, but strategically sound, decision to withdraw his air support. The transports, now exposed, became prime targets. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner feared the complete annihilation of his ships. He pulled the transports out of Lunga Point before the unloading was complete. The withdrawal was a devastating blow. It created a supply vacuum that would define the Marines' first 4 months in combat. As the sun set on August 8th, the Marines watched their lifeline steam away. It took with it essential supplies. These included heavy artillery, engineering equipment, medical supplies, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They were stranded, relying only on what they could scramble ashore. That same night, the Japanese delivered the coup de grace. The Battle of Savo Island, fought in the darkness north of Guadalcanal, became a catastrophic naval defeat. A Japanese strike force, moving with deadly precision, sank 3 U.S. heavy cruisers and 1 Australian heavy cruiser in quick succession. This crippled Allied naval support. The attack claimed over 1,077 American and Allied lives. The sea floor around Guadalcanal soon earned the grim moniker Iron Bottom Sound. The Marines, who had secured the airfield only hours before, were now completely isolated. They were left to face a fanatical enemy. They were equipped with inadequate gear, lacking vital supplies. They were, in the words of the narrator, uncomfortably close to being up shit creek without a paddle. The invasion had begun not with a roar of victory, but with a logistical collapse and the psychological burden of abandonment. The initial landing on Guadalcanal had been characterized by an unnatural, almost terrifying silence. The Marines, pulse rates high, expected a bloodbath. Instead, they found only beautiful white sand beaches and an empty, humid jungle. It was a deceptive calm. Jim McInerney remembered wondering, where the hell are the Japs? That question was answered brutally within days. The answer fundamentally altered the American perception of the Pacific War. On August 12th, the disastrous Gottage Patrol shattered any lingering illusion. They realized the Japanese would not fight like conventional soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Gottage led 25 men on a reconnaissance mission. Faulty intelligence suggested a large Japanese force was prepared to surrender. Instead, they walked into a ruthless ambush. The few surviving members of the patrol were massacred. Their bodies were later discovered mutilated, a gruesome spectacle. This immediately ignited a burning desire for revenge among the Marines. PFC Kenneth Blakesley, witnessing the horror, was permanently traumatized. This moment redefined the conflict. The enemy was not simply military. They were fanatical. They were driven by the Bushido Code and would show no quarter. The fight was now existential. The Marines had secured the ground, but they could not hold it without the sky. The successful establishment of Henderson Field allowed the crucial arrival of the Cactus Air Force on August 20th. Though operating under constant duress and often crippling supply shortages, the airmen began to establish a fragile air superiority. They disrupted Japanese supply lines and provided essential cover. The Japanese, convinced of their own invincibility, responded with costly frontal assaults. The Battle of the Tenaru River, commencing August 21st, saw Colonel Ichiki's detachment launch a massive Banzai charge. Ichiki was overconfident. He had expected to sweep the Americans aside with only 900 men. Instead, the disciplined marine defenses decimated the attackers. They used barbed wire, machine guns, and devastating canister shot from 37mm guns. The Japanese assault, characterized by shrieking and wild arm-waving, resulted in at least 777 enemy dead. American casualties were comparatively light. The myth of the unstoppable Banzai charge was broken. 2 weeks later, the defense of Henderson Field reached its crucible at the Battle of Edson's Ridge. This occurred between September 12th and 14th. Colonel Merritt A. Edson recognized the strategic importance of the high ground and prepared his defenses. His 400 Marines faced an estimated 4,000 Japanese soldiers. This was a staggering 10-to-1 disadvantage. The Japanese committed tactical suicide. They attacked uphill against entrenched positions. They used flares that illuminated their own ranks. Edson personally rallied scared Marines, refusing to yield the ground. By dawn, over 600 Japanese bodies littered the slopes. The victory was pivotal. It demonstrated American resilience under fire. It forged legends like Edson and Captain Kenneth Bailey, who fought heroically despite being wounded. The fighting soon devolved into a brutal attritional struggle. This was particularly true around the Tenaru River, whose mouth served as a crucial defensive barrier. The Japanese, desperate to retake the airfield, launched repeated, fierce attacks. On October 13th, the Japanese attempted to break American resolve through sheer terror. They launched the heaviest naval and air bombardment of the entire war for U.S. Marines. For 30 relentless hours, the entire island shook. The jungle appeared to dance under the barrage. It filled the air with a constant, rumbling roar that tore at nerves. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, feeling the ground tremble. They emerged afterward like drunks after an all-night binge. Though the barrage destroyed vital aviation fuel, the ground defenses held. The ground combat was a ceaseless cycle of close-quarters violence. On October 25th, Sergeant John Basilone earned the Medal of Honor. He repelled wave after wave of attackers with machine guns and a pistol. He expended 26,000 rounds. He fought to clear jammed guns as ammunition ran desperately low. By early November, the 5th Marines were engaged in the most brutal fighting yet. On November 3rd, K/3/5 faced its toughest battle. It featured 2 desperate bayonet charges. Nearly 100 Marines, urged to run at the bastards like your pants are on fire, charged into a Japanese-held ditch. This shattered the enemy's offensive spirit but incurred immense cost. Corporal Weldon DeLong, a natural leader, was killed by a sniper while trying to eliminate hidden Japanese soldiers. His death was a poignant tragedy amidst the chaos. The campaign culminated in the decisive naval battle of Guadalcanal. This occurred between November 11th and 13th. Admiral William F. Bull Halsey committed everything he had to prevent a massive Japanese convoy from landing. The convoy carried 15,000 reinforcements. Despite heavy American losses, the desperate jaw-to-jaw engagement was a success. It resulted in the sinking of the Japanese battleship Hiei. Crucially, it destroyed the transport convoy. With their reinforcements lost, the Japanese campaign was sealed. The Marines had endured malaria, starvation, and constant explosions. The successful defense of Guadalcanal marked the critical turning point in the Pacific. It shifted the initiative irrevocably to the United States. They had beaten the Bushido bastards at their own game. The 1st Marine Division, ravaged by 4 months of starvation and disease on Guadalcanal, was no longer capable of offensive operations. The move to New Britain and the objective of securing the Cape Gloucester airfield was a necessary continuation of the island-hopping campaign. But for the exhausted Marines, it meant a swift return to the familiar misery of the jungle. The environment itself was the primary enemy there. The initial, deceptively quiet landing on Beach Yellow was a tactical ruse by the Japanese. It quickly gave way to a hydrological nightmare. The inadequate, obscured aerial photographs had failed utterly. Areas marked as merely damp flats were, in reality, impassable swamps and waist-deep sinkholes. The sheer physical effort of movement was crushing. Every step was a battle against the squishy red mud that clung like glue. This doubled the weight of uniforms and boots. It ensured widespread cases of trench foot and debilitating jungle rot. The air was heavy, not just with humidity, but with a thick blue-green mist that persisted until midday. This held the oppressive heat close to the ground. It turned the dense jungle into a perpetual, eerie twilight. As the Marines pushed inland, the Japanese, entrenched in a maze of pillboxes and bunkers, forced the conflict into a grinding, attritional meat grinder. The fighting for Suicide Creek became the campaign's grim symbol. The creek itself was a dripping wet, livid green jungle along the bank. It was a deadly nexus where Marines fought back and forth across the water, unable to gain a solid foothold. The Japanese tenacity forced desperate close-quarters countermeasures. During one intense lull, about 10 Japanese soldiers suddenly emerged from hiding. Lieutenant Andy Chiswick led a fierce bayonet charge. He eliminated the remaining enemy in a matter of minutes. This brutal, necessary act of close combat underscored the unforgiving nature of the warfare. Even the crucial engineering efforts were fraught with peril. Bulldozers, essential for cutting paths through the immovable mud, became prime targets. Operators like Sergeant Lane and Corporal Capito were forced to work exposed under constant sniper fire. The most critical fight for high ground came at Waltz Ridge. On the early morning of January 10th, the Japanese launched their first of 5 ferocious Banzai charges against the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The sound of the shrieking attackers, combined with the continuous, deafening roar of the essential 37mm field pieces, shook the jungle. Lieutenant Colonel Louis W. Silent Lou Walt, who had recently taken command, personally ensured the defences held. He instilled the will to fight in his weary troops. Over 200 Japanese bodies were counted on the slopes. This was a testament to the Marines' disciplined defence and the raw courage of leaders like Captain Haldane, who fought heroically through the night. Yet, the immense chaos of the operation meant that death came not only from the unseen enemy, it also came from the very forces meant to protect them. Jim McInerney, recovering from a leg injury, found his physical pain insignificant compared to the news delivered by Lieutenant Tom O'Neill. A short round from a 105mm howitzer, an error of calculation in the jungle, had struck his immediate circle. The shell, intended for the Japanese, killed his close friend Lou Gargano, along with Dutch Schantenbach and Norm Thompson. The arbitrary cruelty of this loss, inflicted by their own side, was a profound psychological blow. McInerney had already witnessed the tragic death of Corporal DeLong on Guadalcanal. The loss of Gargano, a confidant with whom he had shared dreams of life after the war, was devastating. It was an internal wound far worse than any combat injury. The strategic objective of securing the airfield had been achieved, but the Marines remained trapped in the green hell for 3.5 more miserable months. The psychological scars of Cape Gloucester deepened with every passing sodden day. The brief respite granted to the 1st Marine Division was a cruel joke. Pavuvu, chosen by General Geiger based on misleading aerial photographs, was meant to be a tropical paradise. Instead, it was a desolate, 10-mile-long quagmire. The Marines of K/3/5 found themselves immersed once more in oozy mud. They battled not the Japanese, but armies of rats and land crabs. These creatures invaded their tents nightly, screeching and darting over sleeping men. Building their camp from scratch in the constant rain, they endured repulsive food. This included powdered eggs, weevil-infested bread, and a mock lemon drink they mockingly dubbed battery acid. This ordeal was a different kind of hell. It was a test of the psychological endurance that combat had already strained to the breaking point, while other bases, like Banica, offered country club amenities with screened mess halls and beer. Pavuvu offered only isolation and filth. The veterans, whose faces often displayed the vacant, shell-shocked expression known as the Asiatic stare, developed an unbreakable bond forged in shared misery. Their camaraderie was characterized by stoicism and dark humor. When replacements arrived and dared to complain about the conditions, the veterans were merciless. One non-commissioned officer brutally silenced a whining newcomer. He informed him that until he had been in combat, he had nothing to complain about. This hierarchy of suffering underscored the gulf between the green troops and the old breed. Even the island's noxious smells brought back memories of the battlefield. One Marine noted that the stench of burning crabs came pretty damn close to the smell of decomposing corpses. This linked the supposed rest directly back to the trauma they were trying to escape. By early August 1944, the training intensified. McInerney and his friend, Corporal John Teskovich, were assigned to 3rd Platoon. Teskovich was a gutsy coal miner from Pennsylvania with a hot temper and a knack for dark jokes. The long sail from Pavuvu to Guadalcanal concluded on August 31st. There, General William Rupertus, the division commander, delivered a disastrous prediction. He assured the assembled troops that the invasion of Peleliu would be a short, quickie operation. He claimed it would last just 2 or 3 days. This prediction was rooted in fatally flawed intelligence and a questionable strategic objective. Admirals Nimitz and Halsey believed Peleliu, with its heavily defended airfield, could be bypassed, but General Douglas MacArthur, prioritizing the protection of his flank for the upcoming Philippine invasion, insisted on its capture. The Marines sailed for Peleliu under the dangerous illusion of a swift victory. They were unaware they were heading into one of the most brutal and strategically pointless battles of the Pacific War. On September 15th, D-Day, the landing on Orange Beach 2 was met not with the expected confusion of a retreating enemy. It was met with a storm of organized, devastating fire. The Japanese had shifted their tactics entirely. They abandoned suicidal Banzai charges in favor of entrenched attritional warfare. The slow-moving Amtraks, described by the men as turtles, were prime targets. They were burning and spewing black smoke as they approached the shore. The heat on the beach was nearly 115 degrees. The air was thick with coral dust and the metallic scent of blood. Within hours, the Japanese demonstrated the strength of their new defense. Major Robert M. Ashe, commander of the 3rd Battalion, was killed on the beach. The 1st Marines suffered over 500 casualties in the first 2 days alone. The true strategic obstacle was the Uma Brugol Plateau. This jagged, limestone mountain range was honeycombed with hundreds of natural and man-made caves. It transformed the terrain into a Jap hornet's nest. This was the meat grinder where the battle bobbed down. It forced Marines to adopt the excruciatingly costly blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. They had to use flamethrowers and explosives to clear caves one by one. The 1st Marines bore the initial catastrophic weight of this resistance. Colonel Louis B. Shesty, Puller, known for his aggressive frontal assault tactics, pushed depleted companies into near-hopeless situations. This strategy reached its tragic apex on September 19th with the disastrous attack on Hill 100. Captain Everett Pope's company was ordered onto this small, exposed knob of rock. It was barely the size of a tennis court. Through a harrowing night, the company was nearly annihilated. Pope and his men, desperate and out of ammunition, resorted to throwing rocks at the enemy to confuse them in the dark. By dawn, only 9 survivors remained out of 25. Pope, later awarded the Medal of Honor, expressed a profound resentment. He questioned why Puller had sent him and his men to their destruction for a piece of ground of such dubious value. By September 22nd, the 1st Marines had lost 56% of their strength. Their survivors shambled back from the lines, torn, filthy, and hollow-eyed. This was a chilling premonition for the 5th Marines who were now moving up. The 5th Marines advanced through the treacherous West Road, quickly earning the nickname Sniper Alley. The fighting was relentless, characterized by close quarters slaughter in a maze of ridges. On September 28th, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, launched an amphibious assault on Jezeva. It was led by amphibian tanks that moved like giant turtles across the water. It was during the advance through this unforgiving landscape that the narrator witnessed the final tragic moment of his friend, John Teskovich. Teskovich had survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. He maintained a grim, fatalistic optimism. He joked constantly about his GI insurance. He noted that if he died, at least his father would get rich, allowing him to avoid returning to the suffocating darkness of the coal mine. But on Sniper Alley, the relentless, unseen enemy claimed him. Teskovich was struck by sniper fire, crumpling instantly. His final words, choked out in pain, carried a grim, heartbreaking irony. He expressed his desire for his father to finally get rich. McInerney and PFC Sterling Mace were left to tend to their fallen comrade amidst the chaos. The emotional toll of the loss compounded the immense physical violence of the Umabrogol pocket. the quickie battle had devolved into the slimiest, non-stop fighting that a human being can experience. Peleliu was not just a battle, but a needless tragedy that consumed the lives of the best men the Corps had to offer. The survivors of the Umabrogol pocket emerged as ghosts of their former selves. The relentless close-quarters combat on Peleliu had inflicted a physical and psychological exhaustion so profound that it manifested in the vacant, unblinking stare common among veterans. This was sometimes called the Asiatic strain. They had endured the stench of death, the pervasive blowflies, and the constant, unnerving tension of fighting an unseen fanatical enemy entrenched in over 500 caves. When the exhausted Marines of K/3/5 were finally relieved by army troops, the newcomers looked visibly terrified by the landscape. The Nami says, the psychological gulf between the old breed and the replacements was immense. The devastating cost of the campaign was brought home not by a general's speech, but by a single photograph. After the fighting ended, the surviving men of K/3/5 were gathered for a company picture. Only 85 Marines were available to stand for the photograph. This was a stark, visual testimony to the carnage. The authorized strength of the company on D-Day had been 236 men. Seeing the empty spaces, the reality sank in. K/3/5 had suffered a casualty rate of 64%. Nearly two-thirds of their comrades were killed or wounded. For Jim McInerney had seen his friends DeLong, Gargano, and Teskevich fall. The photo session was a silent, devastating confrontation with the scale of their loss. Following the ordeal, the Marines were moved to a neat bivouac area. It was a temporary oasis of relative comfort before the voyage back to Pavuvu. The 8-day sail provided a chance to process the chaos under the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific stars. Back on the desolate island, the living conditions had improved. They featured actual showers, fresh water, and even an outdoor movie screen. This was a bizarre, fragile semblance of normalcy. The true psychological shock came with the jarring re-entry into civilization. On Pavuvu, the Marines encountered a group of Red Cross nurses. Young, attractive, and white, these women were so profoundly alien after months of isolation and constant violence that the sight of them felt surreal. McInerney remembered looking at them as if they were creatures from another world. He realized the immense gulf that now separated the men of the Umabrogol pocket from the world they had sworn to protect. He felt tired and numb. He constantly wrestled with the fear that he might wake up and find himself back in the suffocating darkness of a combat foxhole. His original 1940 enlistment was nearing its end, but the thought of simply returning home felt impossible. McInerney's combat experience drove a new, urgent purpose. He carried the hard-won lessons of survival, the understanding of enemy treachery, and the knowledge of what inadequate preparation cost. He chose to extend his enlistment and become a drill instructor. This was not a career move, it was a moral imperative. He was determined to impart the brutal, practical survival skills he had learned in the Green Hell to new recruits. He believed that his experience could directly save lives during the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. He reported to drill instructor training at Paris Island in February 1945. He was mentored by seasoned instructors who understood the gravity of their task. The need for this training, however, vanished in a flash of atomic fire. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Emperor Hirohito's announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, abruptly ended the war. The anticipated invasion, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives, was averted. The global conflict had concluded, but the transition for the veterans was protracted. McInerney's service continued until late September 1946. He officially became a civilian on November 27, 1946, after nearly 6 years in the Corps. The journey home, arriving in San Francisco on December 21, 1944, was marked by an impatience to reconnect with the world they had left behind. McInerney and his buddies bypassed the staged welcome home show. They were desperate instead for a phone to contact their families. The long train ride to Brooklyn concluded on January 8, 1945, with an emotional, tearful reunion with his mother. The resilience forged in his tough childhood and the crucible of combat enabled him to face civilian challenges with a unique, unshakable perspective. Yet the victory was not without its lingering resentments and critical retrospective. The narrator's experience gave him an unvarnished, grunt's-eye view of the war. This led to fierce criticism of the strategic leadership. He condemned President Roosevelt's Europe First strategy. He argued it deliberately delayed crucial support for Pacific defenders. This left the Philippines high and dry and resulted in immense needless suffering. He specifically targeted General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's ego and blunders were perceived as contributing to thousands of needless American casualties. These blunders included destroying air power in the Philippines and abandoning troops on Bataan and Corregidor. They also included engaging in publicity stunts from the safety of Australia. The strategic pointlessness of Pellier, insisted upon by MacArthur, became the ultimate symbol of a senseless sacrifice. The final insult, a slight that lingered long after the guns fell silent, came at the official Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Despite the Marines having fought the pivotal, costly island campaigns that broke the back of the Japanese Empire, Marine generals were overlooked. Generals like Vandergrift, Geiger, and Smith were excluded from the public spectacle. This omission underscored a perceived institutional slight against the men who had endured hellish combat. Ultimately, the enduring legacy was the brotherhood. The veterans were bound by the shared experience of misery and violence at Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. They carried the unbreakable ethos of Semper Fidelis. The war had taught them that survival required ruthlessness against an enemy who deliberately shot unarmed corpsmen. But it had also taught them the profound value of human connection and sacrifice. The narrator's journey from a boy yearning for belonging to a seasoned combat veteran cemented his conviction. The moral imperative was to remember these tragic times and terrible places, and the immense sacrifices made. This was to ensure that such unnecessary suffering and loss of life would never be repeated for future generations.